In the brutal theater of medieval politics, few deaths were designed to send a message as clear and terrifying as what befell Hugh Despenser the Younger in November 1326. His screams echoed through Hereford as executioners methodically dismantled not just his body, but his very identity as a man. This wasn't merely an execution, it was a calculated performance of revenge, humiliation, and political theater that shocked even a society accustomed to public brutality. Hugh Despenser had risen from minor nobility to become the most powerful man in England, second only to King Edward II himself. For over a decade, he wielded influence that made earls tremble and queens plot in shadows. But when Queen Isabella finally struck back, she ensured that Despenser's end would match the cruelty he had inflicted upon others. The method of his death was chosen not for efficiency, but for maximum suffering and symbolic destruction. Medieval chroniclers, typically reserved in their descriptions of violence, wrote of Despenser's execution with unusual detail and barely concealed satisfaction. They understood they were witnessing not just the end of a man, but the violent conclusion of one of England's most turbulent political chapters. The very brutality of his death tells us everything we need to know about the fear and hatred he inspired during his lifetime. What transforms a minor lord into the shadow ruler of a kingdom, and what kind of reign of terror justifies such an elaborate and sadistic execution? The story of Hugh Despenser is one of unchecked ambition, royal favoritism, and the inevitable price of absolute power. His rise was meteoric, his influence absolute, and his fall catastrophic. Today, we descend into the darkest corners of medieval England to uncover the twisted tale of the king's favorite who flew too close to the sun. This is the story of how political ambition became a death sentence, and how medieval justice could be more terrifying than any torture device ever conceived. Hugh Despenser the Younger was born around 1286 into a world where loyalty to the crown could elevate a family to unimaginable heights, or destroy them entirely. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had already established the family's reputation as skilled courtiers and ruthless politicians. The younger Hugh inherited not just his father's name, but his cunning and his dangerous appetite for power. The England of Hugh's youth was a kingdom in transition. Edward I, the formidable Hammer of the Scots, had died in 1307, leaving the throne to his son, Edward II. The new king was a stark contrast to his warrior father, more interested in rustic pursuits and the company of male favorites than in the business of ruling an empire. This weakness at the center of power created opportunities for ambitious men like Hugh Despenser. Edward II's reign began under a cloud of scandal with his relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight who became the king's companion. Gaveston's arrogance and the king's obvious favoritism toward him enraged the English nobility, who saw their own influence diminished by this foreign upstart. The baron's fury eventually led to Gaveston's murder in 1312, but this only created a vacuum that Hugh Despenser was perfectly positioned to fill. Unlike Gaveston, who was seen as an outsider, Hugh Despenser was undeniably English nobility. He possessed the political instincts that Gaveston lacked, understanding that true power lay not in flaunting royal favoritism, but in systematically building an unassailable position within the existing power structure. Where Gaveston had been content with titles and wealth, Despenser sought something far more dangerous: actual control over the machinery of government. By 1318, Hugh Despenser had maneuvered himself into the king's inner circle, becoming Edward II's new favorite, and many suspected his lover. But Despenser brought to this relationship a level of political sophistication and ruthless ambition that would make Gaveston's influence seem modest by comparison. He didn't simply want to be the king's companion, he wanted to be the king's voice, his hand, and ultimately his replacement in all but name. The transformation of Hugh Despenser from courtier to shadow ruler began with his appointment to key positions within Edward II's administration. By 1322, he held the title of Chamberlain, giving him direct access to the king at all hours and control over who else could reach the monarch. This position became the foundation of his power, allowing him to filter information, influence decisions, and gradually isolate Edward from other advisors. Despenser's methods were methodical and ruthless. He began by identifying potential threats among the nobility and systematically neutralizing them through a combination of legal manipulation, economic pressure, and, when necessary, outright violence. Lords who opposed him found their lands confiscated on trumped-up charges, their family members imprisoned, and their traditional rights stripped away through creative interpretations of feudal law. The Welsh marches became Despenser's particular obsession, and the primary source of his growing wealth. These border regions, traditionally governed by semi-autonomous lords, were rich in land and resources. Despenser used his influence with the king to engineer conflicts with the marcher lords, then swooped in to claim their territories when they were defeated or forced into exile. Within a few years, he had assembled a personal domain that rivaled royal holdings. What made Despenser particularly dangerous was his understanding of bureaucracy and law. Unlike previous royal favorites who relied solely on the king's protection, Despenser built a network of legal justifications for his actions. He packed courts with his supporters, manipulated parliamentary proceedings, and created a paper trail that gave his land grabs and political persecutions the veneer of legitimacy. This systematic approach meant that his victims often found themselves legally powerless to resist. By 1324, Hugh Despenser had effectively become the ruler of England in all but name. Edward II, increasingly dependent on his favorites' counsel and affection, rarely made important decisions without consulting him. Foreign ambassadors reported that audiences with the king were meaningless unless Despenser was present, and that the real negotiations happened in private meetings with the favorite. The traditional nobility found themselves cut out of government entirely, reduced to spectators in their own kingdom. The reign of Hugh Despenser was marked by a systematic campaign of terror against anyone who dared oppose him. His enemies didn't simply face political marginalization, they faced complete destruction. The Earl of Lancaster, one of the most powerful nobles in England and a cousin to the king, was executed in 1322 after daring to rebel against Despenser's influence. This execution sent a clear message: not even royal blood would protect those who stood against the favorite. Despenser's persecution of his enemies extended beyond simple elimination to deliberate humiliation and suffering. Lords who opposed him were not simply killed or exiled, they were first stripped of their dignity through public trials filled with fabricated charges, forced to watch as their families were imprisoned or impoverished, and subjected to punishments designed to break their spirits before breaking their bodies. The psychological torture often proved more effective than physical violence. The favorite's network of informants and supporters penetrated every level of English society. Servants in noble households, clerks in government offices, and even members of the clergy found themselves either recruited or coerced into serving Despenser's intelligence network. This created an atmosphere of paranoia where no conversation was safe and no alliance was secure. The traditional bonds of feudal loyalty began to dissolve under the pressure of Despenser's surveillance state. Women were not exempt from Despenser's cruelty, and in many cases, they suffered disproportionately. The wives and daughters of his enemies were used as leverage, imprisoned in harsh conditions, or forced into marriages that served his political purposes. Lady Alice Deasy, one of the wealthiest heiresses in England, was essentially kidnapped and forced to live under Despenser's control so he could manage her vast estates. These attacks on women violated the chivalric codes that supposedly govern noble behavior, and added to the growing outrage against his rule. Perhaps most disturbing was Despenser's treatment of the church and its officials. Despite the medieval reverence for religious authority, he showed no hesitation in imprisoning bishops, confiscating church lands, and manipulating religious law to serve his purposes. When Bishop Adam Allerton of Hereford dared to criticize royal policy, Despenser had him arrested and tortured. This sacrilegious behavior shocked contemporary observers, and added accusations of impiety to the growing list of charges against him. The breaking point came with Queen Isabella herself. Edward III's queen, daughter of the King of France, and one of the most powerful women in Europe, found herself increasingly marginalized and humiliated by Despenser's dominance over her husband. The favorite made no secret of his contempt for the queen, blocking her access to Edward and systematically reducing her household and income. But Isabella was not a woman to be dismissed quietly. In 1325, Isabella was sent to France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV, over disputed territories in Gascony. This diplomatic mission gave her the opportunity she needed to escape Despenser's control and begin organizing resistance to his regime. Once in France, She began gathering support from English exiles and disaffected nobles who had fled Despenser's persecution. Her cause gained powerful support when she formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, one of the Marcher lords who had escaped Despenser's earlier purges. Isabella's propaganda campaign against Despenser was masterful in its simplicity and effectiveness. She portrayed herself as the wronged queen, driven from her own kingdom by the unnatural influence of her husband's favorite. She emphasized Despenser's violations of traditional law and custom, his attacks on the church, and his destruction of noble families. Most effectively, she painted him as a foreign corruption of English values despite his English birth. The Queen's message resonated powerfully with audiences across Europe, who were familiar with the dangers of royal favorites and the chaos they could create. Isabella presented herself as the defender of legitimate government against tyranny, and her cause attracted support from nobles, merchants, and common people who had suffered under Despenser's rule. By 1326, she had assembled an invasion force and was ready to return to England. The invasion itself was almost anticlimactic. When Isabella landed in Essex in September 1326, she was welcomed as a liberator rather than resisted as an invader. The common people, exhausted by years of Despenser's oppression, flocked to her banner. More importantly, the nobles who had been cowed into submission by fear of the favorite saw their opportunity for revenge and abandoned Edward II en masse. Edward II and the Despensers fled westward toward Wales, hoping to find sanctuary in regions where Hugh's power had been strongest. But even there, support melted away as local leaders calculated that their future lay with the Queen rather than the discredited king and his favorite. The network of fear and patronage that had sustained Despenser's power proved to be built on quicksand when tested by real opposition. Spencer the Elder was captured, first seized by Isabella's forces as he attempted to defend Bristol Castle. His execution was swift but brutal. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor, his head displayed on London Bridge as a warning to others. But this was merely the appetizer for the main course that would follow when his son was captured. Hugh Despenser the Younger was finally taken near Llantresant in Wales on November 16, 1326. Contemporary accounts describe him as already broken by the collapse of his world. The man who had terrorized England for over a decade was reduced to a trembling figure, having allegedly attempted suicide rather than face capture. His captors, however, had no intention of allowing him such an easy escape from justice. The decision about Despenser's fate was never in doubt, but the method of his execution became a matter of careful planning. Queen Isabella and her supporters understood that this death needed to serve multiple purposes. It must satisfy the desire for revenge among Despenser's many victims, serve as a deterrent to future royal favorites, and symbolically cleanse the kingdom of his corruption. The execution they designed was a masterpiece of medieval political theater. On November 24, 1326, Hugh Despenser was brought to Hereford for his final performance. The choice of location was significant. Hereford was in the Welsh Marches, where his power had been strongest, and it was the seat of Bishop Adam, whom Despenser had tortured. The crowd that gathered was enormous, drawn not just by morbid curiosity, but by a genuine desire to witness the end of their oppressor. Despenser was not granted the courtesy of a trial, though his crimes were read aloud to the assembled crowd. The list was extensive: treason against the crown, theft of royal lands, persecution of nobles, attacks on the church, and corruption of the king's natural affections. Each charge was met with roars of approval from the crowd, who had waited years for this moment of justice. The executioners had been carefully instructed in their duties, and they approached their work with the precision of craftsmen. This was not to be a simple beheading or hanging, it was to be a demonstration of what happened to those who dared to corrupt the natural order of the kingdom. Every aspect of the punishment was designed with symbolic meaning, and every cut was calculated to inflict maximum suffering while preserving consciousness. Despenser was first stripped naked and paraded through the streets of Hereford, allowing the crowd to see the physical reality of the man who had terrorized them for so long. The once powerful favorite, reduced to trembling flesh, became an object of mockery and hatred. Verses mocking his relationship with the king were shouted by spectators, and refuse was thrown at his defenseless body. The actual execution began with Despenser being dragged through the streets tied to a horse, his body battered again. Stones and debris. This preliminary torture served to weaken him physically while providing entertainment for the crowd. By the time he reached the scaffold, he was already bloodied and barely conscious. But the main event was yet to begin. The execution of Hugh Despenser was designed to be a systematic destruction of his identity as a man, a noble, and a human being. The first stage involved his being hanged by the neck, but not until death. The rope was carefully calibrated to cause suffering and loss of consciousness without ending his life. As he dangled, gasping and choking, the crowd cheered and jeered at the men who had once held their lives in his hands. When Despenser was cut down, still alive but barely conscious, the second phase began. In a deliberate mockery of his alleged relationship with King Edward II, the executioners proceeded to castrate him, removing his genitals with a knife and casting them into a fire prepared for that purpose. This act was both literal and symbolic. It represented the severing of the unnatural bond between the king and his favorite while inflicting the most intimate form of humiliation possible. The disembowelment followed, with Despenser's abdomen being cut open and his entrails slowly drawn out while he remained conscious. Medieval medical knowledge was sufficient to keep victims alive through this process, and the executioners were skilled in prolonging suffering. His heart was cut out and thrown into the fire, symbolically destroying the seat of his corrupt affections and treasonous thoughts. Throughout this ordeal, Despenser remained conscious, his screams mixing with the cheers of the crowd. Contemporary chroniclers noted that he seemed to be trying to speak, perhaps attempting to beg for mercy or make some final confession, but his words were lost in the noise of his own agony and the crowd's celebration. The man who had once commanded absolute silence when he spoke was now unable to make himself heard above his own suffering. The final stage of the execution involved the quartering of Despenser's body. His limbs were tied to horses and torn from his torso in a spectacular display of dismemberment. His head was cut off and displayed on London Bridge, joining that of his father as a warning to others. The remaining parts of his body were distributed to various cities throughout England, ensuring that his destruction was witnessed across the kingdom. The immediate aftermath of Despenser's execution was a mixture of celebration and political maneuvering. The crowds in Hereford celebrated late into the night, treating the death as a festival rather than a somber execution. Songs and poems mocking the dead favorite circulated throughout England, many of them explicitly sexual in nature and designed to further humiliate his memory. Queen Isabella moved quickly to consolidate her power and legitimize her rebellion. Within weeks of Despenser's death, King Edward II was forced to. Edward III, with Isabella serving as regent, the official narrative became that she had saved England from the corruption of evil councillors and restored legitimate government. Despenser's execution was presented as necessary justice rather than revenge. The psychological impact of Despenser's death on the English nobility was profound and lasting. The elaborate nature of his execution served as a powerful deterrent to future royal favorites, who might be tempted to accumulate similar power. For generations afterward, courtiers would remember the fate of Hugh Despenser when considering how far to push their influence with weak kings. The financial consequences of Despenser's fall were equally dramatic. His vast estates were redistributed among Isabella's supporters, fundamentally reshaping the power structure of English nobility. Families that had been impoverished by his persecution suddenly found themselves restored to wealth and influence, while those who had collaborated with him faced ruin and exile. The international implications were significant as well. European courts had watched Despenser's rise with fascination and horror, and his execution was seen as a victory for legitimate government over tyranny. Isabella's successful rebellion became a model for other queens and nobles who faced similar threats from corrupt favorites and weak rulers. The legacy of Hugh Despenser's execution extends far beyond medieval England into the broader history of political violence and state power. His death represents one of the most elaborate and symbolic executions in English history, designed not just to end a life but to send a message about the consequences of overreaching ambition and the corruption of royal authority. The method of his execution, combining hanging, castration, disembowelment, and quartering, became a template for the punishment of traitors that would persist in English law until the 18th century. The legal precedent established by his case influenced how future cases of high treason were prosecuted and punished, embedding his suffering into the very structure of English jurisprudence. Modern historians continue to debate the extent of Despenser's crimes, and whether his punishment was proportionate to his offenses. While few defend his actions during his years of power, many argue that the elaborate cruelty of his execution reveals as much about his enemy's capacity for vengeance as it does about his own evil. The spectacle of his death arguably brutalized English political culture and normalized extreme violence as a tool of governance. The sexual aspects of Despenser's punishment, particularly his castration, reflect medieval attitudes toward homosexuality and the perceived threat posed by unnatural relationships between men. His death became a cautionary tale about the dangers of sexual deviance corrupting political power, a theme that would recur throughout history. In English history, whenever royal favorites were suspected of intimate relationships with their monarchs, the psychological dimensions of Despenser's execution also deserve consideration. The elaborate nature of his punishment suggests that his enemies needed not just his death, but his complete destruction and humiliation. This points to the profound trauma and rage that his years of oppression had created among the English nobility and common people. As we reflect on the horrific death of Hugh Despenser the Younger, we confront uncomfortable truths about power, justice, and human nature that transcend the medieval period. His story reveals how quickly unchecked authority can corrupt even those born to privilege and education, transforming them into monsters who view other human beings as obstacles to be eliminated or tools to be used. The elaborate cruelty of his execution forces us to examine our own assumptions about justice and proportionality. While Despenser undoubtedly committed serious crimes against many innocent people, the spectacle of his death raises questions about whether any human being deserves such systematic torture and humiliation, regardless of their offenses. The crowd's enthusiastic participation in his suffering reveals the dangerous pleasure that humans can take in witnessing the destruction of those they hate. The political lessons of Despenser's rise and fall remain relevant in our own time. His story demonstrates how institutional weakness at the center of power creates opportunities for ambitious individuals to accumulate dangerous influence through manipulation and intimidation. The gradual erosion of legal and traditional constraints that enabled his tyranny offers warnings about the fragility of democratic institutions and the rule of law. Perhaps most disturbing is how Despenser's regime normalized extreme behavior through a combination of fear, corruption, and the gradual expansion of acceptable cruelty. His victims often found themselves complicit in their own oppression, trapped by a system that punished resistance more severely than collaboration. This dynamic reveals how tyranny perpetuates itself by corrupting the moral framework of entire societies. The ultimate lesson of Hugh Despenser's horrific end may be that the line between civilization and barbarism is far thinner than we like to believe. His execution, for all its medieval trappings, was carried out by educated, supposedly Christian people who believed they were serving justice. The ease with which they embraced elaborate cruelty in the name of righteousness should serve as a permanent warning about the human capacity for evil, regardless of the historical period or cultural context in which we find ourselves.